The ion storm hit Kepler 78b like a cosmic tantrum, turning the mining station's usually predictable routine into a light show that would have been beautiful if it wasn't trying to kill everyone. David Park watched through the reinforced viewport of his workshop as purple lightning danced between the station's solar collectors, each bolt carrying enough energy to power a small city or, more relevantly, fry every piece of electronic equipment on the station if the shielding failed. Just another peaceful Tuesday on the frontier, he muttered, adjusting the electromagnetic dampeners around his more sensitive repair equipment. The storm had already knocked out 2 of the station's 3 communication arrays, which meant no incoming ships for at least another day. Perfect for catching up on the backlog of environmental suits that had been piling up since the last mining accident. David had been expecting the usual quiet evening of recalibrating pressure seals and replacing worn servo motors when the proximity alarms started screaming. Through the chaos of the storm, something big was coming in fast and completely out of control. The emergency beacon was broadcasting on all frequencies, a transport ship with critical systems failure, requesting immediate assistance. "Well, there goes my quiet evening," David said, pulling on his emergency response gear. The station's rescue protocols were about as sophisticated as everything else on Kepler 78b, which is to say they mostly involved hoping for the best and keeping the medical bay stocked with bandages. The ship that crashed into the station's emergency landing bay looked like it had been through a blender designed by someone with a grudge against aerospace engineering. Hull plates were missing, the engine compartments were venting atmosphere, and the entire starboard section appeared to have been melted and reformed by some kind of energy weapon. David had seen combat damage before, but this was different, systematic, thorough, the kind of destruction that suggested someone had been very angry and very professional about expressing it. The rescue team found only one survivor, and David's first thought upon seeing her was that she'd probably been the reason for all that professional anger. Kiravel stood nearly 7 feet tall, which would have been impressive enough without the biomechanical armor that added another few inches and made her look like she could arm wrestle a mining mech and win. Her elongated ears, characteristic of the Valerian species, twitched with obvious pain, but she maintained the kind of rigid posture that suggested collapsing was for other people. The armor itself was a masterpiece of engineering and a testament to the kind of damage a professional warrior could accumulate, scarred, patched, and sparking with electrical failures that should have shut down the entire system hours ago. "I require no assistance," she announced to the rescue team in a voice like controlled thunder. "My equipment will be repaired and I will depart when the storm passes." "Right," said Station Chief Williams, a man who'd learned that arguing with heavily armed aliens was generally bad for station morale. "You can use Bay 12 for repairs. David here runs our equipment maintenance, if you need anything." Kiravel's gaze fixed on David with the intensity of a targeting system. "I repair my own equipment." David looked at the sparking, fluid-leaking disaster that was her armor and tried to think of a diplomatic way to say, "You're going to electrocute yourself." "I'm sure you do," he said instead. "Bay 12 has full diagnostic equipment if you need it. No charge for station guests." He'd expected her to dismiss the offer and probably him along with it. Instead, she studied him with those unsettling alien eyes, taking in his work clothes, the precision tools on his belt, and the oil stains that marked him as someone who actually worked with his hands rather than just talked about it. "Acceptable," she said finally, then turned and walked toward Bay 12 with the kind of stride that suggested pain was a minor inconvenience she'd learned to ignore. David followed at a safe distance, mostly because he was curious about Valerian armor technology, but partly because he'd noticed the way her left leg servo was hitching every third step. The armor's gyroscopic stabilizers were clearly failing, which meant she was using pure muscle control to maintain that intimidating stride. It was impressive, but it was also unsustainable. Bay 12 was one of the station's better-equipped maintenance areas, with full environmental controls and diagnostic systems that could interface with most known technology. David watched as Kiravel attempted to connect her armor's systems to the diagnostic array, her movements precise despite the obvious fatigue. The first connection failed. The second produced a shower of sparks that would have been concerning if the armor hadn't already been sparking on its own. Incompatible interface protocols, she said, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite what David suspected was significant frustration. I might be able to help with that, David offered. I've worked on Valerian equipment before. Not armor, but some of your people's mining gear uses similar bioneural interfaces. Kiravel turned to study him again, and David noticed that her ears, which he'd learned were incredibly sensitive sensory organs, were tracking micromovements in his posture and expression. She was reading him like a diagnostic readout, evaluating threat levels and competence in ways he probably couldn't imagine. You have experience with biomechanical systems? Some. Mostly repair work, nothing fancy. David gestured at the diagnostic equipment. But I know how to make different technologies talk to each other, and right now your armor looks like it's trying to have an argument with itself. For the first time since the rescue, something that might have been amusement flickered across Kiravel's features. An apt description. She attempted another diagnostic connection, this time with David's guidance on interface protocols. The system linked successfully, and immediately began displaying readouts that made David's engineering background very concerned. Power fluctuations, neural interface failures, structural integrity warnings. The armor was holding together through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and superior design margins. How long have you been wearing this without proper maintenance? David asked, studying the cascade of error messages. Proper maintenance is not always available in combat situations. David looked at the chronometer readings embedded in the diagnostic data. This says the armor hasn't had a full system check in 8 months. Correct. And you've been fighting in it? Correct. David stared at the readouts, trying to process the idea of someone using biomechanical armor, equipment that interfaced directly with the nervous system, without proper maintenance for that long. It was like performing surgery with tools you weren't sure were sterile, or flying a ship with engines you hoped were still attached. He began, then stopped himself before saying something that might sound like criticism. That must have been uncomfortable. Kiravel's ears twitched, and David caught what looked like surprise in her expression before she suppressed it. Discomfort is irrelevant. Function is what matters. Right, but if the armor isn't functioning properly, that affects your performance, doesn't it? These neural interface errors alone must be causing feedback delays. I compensate. David nodded, recognizing the tone of someone who'd gotten very good at making the best of bad situations. I bet you do. But you shouldn't have to. That seemed to catch her off guard. She studied him for a long moment, her ears rotating slightly as if trying to pick up some signal he wasn't aware of transmitting. You offer assistance. If you want it. No obligation either way. David gestured at the diagnostic data. But honestly, I'm curious about how this system works. Valerian biomechanical engineering is supposed to be some of the most advanced in the galaxy. I'd love to see it operating properly instead of held together with determination and prayer. Kiravel was quiet for so long that David began to wonder if he'd overstepped some cultural boundary. Then, very slowly, she began removing her armored gauntlets, revealing hands that were scarred but elegant, with long fingers adapted for both fine manipulation and combat. You may proceed, she said formally. But understand, this armor has kept me alive for 15 years. Treat it with appropriate respect. David looked at the ancient, battle-scarred, barely functional masterpiece of engineering that she'd been trusting with her life for a decade and a half. Like it's the most important thing in the galaxy, he promised. David had worked on plenty of sophisticated equipment in his years as an engineer, but Valerian biomechanical armor was in a category entirely its own. The diagnostic readings showed a fusion of organic neural pathways and quantum-enhanced defensive systems that responded to everything from emotional states to anticipated threats. It was like someone had taken the nervous system of a very large, very dangerous animal and convinced it to wear clothes. This is remarkable, he said, studying the schematic that the diagnostic system had finally managed to extract from the armor's memory cores. The bioneural interfaces actually adapt to your specific neural patterns. It's not just armor, it's like a second nervous system. Kiravel nodded stiffly. Valerian armor bonds with its wearer. Over time, the systems learn to anticipate needs, compensate for injuries, enhance natural responses. Which explains why the maintenance requirements are so specific, David said, highlighting sections of the diagnostic that showed neural pathway degradation. These biomechanical interfaces need to be calibrated to your exact specifications. Generic maintenance protocols would be like trying to fix someone's spine with a socket wrench. He noticed Kiravel's ears twitch at the comparison, and wondered if he'd been too casual about something that was obviously deeply personal to her. "I apologize if that sounded dismissive," he said. "I just meant that this level of integration requires very specialized care." "It does." Kiravel's voice held a note David couldn't quite identify. "Most maintenance is performed by Valerian technicians who understand the bonding process. And you've been without access to those technicians for 8 months. Correct." David studied the readouts again, noting the cascade of system compensations and workarounds that the armor had developed to keep functioning despite increasing failures. It was like watching someone perform surgery on themselves, technically possible, but definitely not recommended. "All right," he said, pulling up the interface protocols. "I'm going to need to access some of the primary neural connection points to recalibrate the biomechanical systems. That means working near the spine interface and the shoulder junction points." Kiravel went very still. "Explain the procedure." David highlighted the relevant areas on the diagnostic display. "The armor has micro-connection points along your spinal column that handle sensory input and motor response coordination. They're probably misaligned after months without proper calibration, which is causing the feedback delays you've been compensating for." "I see. The good news is, it's mostly a matter of precision adjustment. Like tuning a musical instrument, except the instrument is connected to your nervous system and keeps you alive." David paused, realizing how that sounded. "Which I promise makes it sound more complicated than it actually is." "You have performed this procedure before?" "Not on Valerian armor specifically, but I've worked with bioneural interfaces in mining equipment. The principles are similar, just much more sophisticated." David looked at her carefully. "But if you're not comfortable with someone else handling the adjustments, I understand. This is very personal equipment." Kiravel studied him for a long moment, her elongated ears tracking minute changes in his posture and expression. David had the distinct impression he was being evaluated according to criteria he couldn't begin to guess at. "Proceed," she said finally. "But explain each step." David nodded and began gathering the precision tools he'd need for the delicate work. "First step is to establish a stable connection with the primary diagnostic port near the base of the neck. The armor needs to trust the external systems before it will allow access to the neural interfaces." He moved behind her, noting how her posture remained perfectly controlled despite what had to be considerable pain from the malfunctioning systems. The diagnostic port was hidden beneath a section of armored plating that had been damaged in whatever battle had disabled her ship. "I'm going to need to remove this outer plate to access the connection," David said, his hands hovering near the damaged armor. "Is that all right?" "Proceed." David's first touch was feather-light, testing the security of the damaged plating before applying any pressure. The metal was warm, heated by the malfunctioning systems beneath, and he could feel the subtle vibrations of the biomechanical components trying to compensate for their failures. "This is going to feel strange," he warned, beginning to carefully disconnect the damaged plate. "The armor's going to be confused about why someone other than you is handling its primary systems." Kiravel made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, but David noticed her shoulders tense as he worked. The armor plate came free with a soft hiss of pressurized seals, revealing the elegant complexity of the bioneural interface beneath. "Beautiful," David said softly, examining the network of organic conduits and quantum processors that formed the armor's primary nervous system. "This is incredible engineering. You approve of Valerian craftsmanship?" "I approve of any technology this sophisticated that's kept someone alive for 15 years, David replied, making the initial diagnostic connection with movements so careful they were barely perceptible. Though I have to ask, how much of this time have you spent in active combat? Most of it. David paused in his work, processing that information. You've been wearing this armor in combat situations for 15 years, with only field maintenance. When necessary. Which was most of the time. Correct. David found himself staring at the scarred, patched, obviously repaired components that made up her armor's primary systems. Each repair told a story of damage, emergency fixes, and someone pushing equipment far beyond its design specifications because the alternative was death. Kiravel, he said gently, when was the last time someone did maintenance on this armor because you deserved proper equipment, not because you needed to be combat ready? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her ears went very still, and David felt the tension in her shoulders increase. I do not understand the distinction. David carefully began the calibration process, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering the armor's defensive protocols. I mean, when was the last time someone worked on your armor because they wanted to make sure you were comfortable and safe, rather than just functionally effective? Kiravel was quiet for so long that David began to wonder if he'd crossed some cultural line. Then, very softly, she said, that is not how Valerian equipment maintenance is approached. How is it approached? Efficiently. With focus on combat readiness and operational capacity. David nodded, continuing the delicate work of realigning neural pathways that had been operating out of specification for months. That makes sense from a military perspective. But this armor isn't just equipment, is it? It's part of you. As he spoke, David noticed something in the biomechanical responses that made him pause. The armor's stress indicators were spiking, but not from his work, from the conversation. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I didn't mean to upset the system integration. Let me just focus on the technical work. No, Kiravel said, her voice unusually quiet. Continue. Both the repair and the discussion. David resumed the careful calibration, but he found himself thinking about the implications of what he was seeing. This armor had been maintaining a warrior for 15 years, compensating for injuries and stress and combat damage, all while receiving only the minimum maintenance necessary to keep it functional. It was like discovering that someone had been performing surgery with tools they'd never been allowed to properly sterilize. There, he said as the first neural pathway came back into proper alignment. How does that feel? Kiravel's entire posture changed subtly, and David heard her make a soft sound that might have been surprise. Different, she said. The feedback delay in my left arm is gone. Good. That's what we want. David moved to the next connection point, his touch remaining feather-light and careful. I'm going to work on the shoulder interface next. This might feel more intense, it's closer to major nerve clusters. As his fingers found the damaged connection housing, David felt Kiravel flinch slightly. Not from pain, he realized, but from the unfamiliar sensation of someone handling her equipment with care rather than efficiency. You're being very gentle, she said, and there was something in her voice that David couldn't quite identify. Precision work requires a light touch, he replied. Besides, this armor has been through enough trauma. It deserves to be treated with respect. Another pause, longer this time. You speak of it as if it were alive. Isn't it, partially? David asked, carefully realigning microprocessors that had been operating out of tolerance for months. I mean, it learns, adapts, bonds with you. It's been keeping you alive and healthy for 15 years. That seems pretty alive to me. I had not considered that perspective. David finished the shoulder interface and moved to the next connection point, his movements remaining slow and deliberate. How does that feel? Kiravel rolled her shoulder experimentally, and David could see the amazement in her posture as the joint moved smoothly for the first time in months. It feels, she began, then stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet. It feels like it did when it was new. That's the idea, David said with a smile she couldn't see. Now, let's see what we can do about the rest of these systems. But as he continued the delicate work, David found himself wondering about the woman beneath the armor, and what it meant to spend 15 years in equipment that no one had ever maintained with anything resembling gentleness. 3 hours into the repair process, David had developed a profound respect for both Valerian engineering and Curavel's pain tolerance. The biomechanical systems were more complex than anything he'd encountered, but they were also more damaged than he'd initially realized. Every interface point told a story of battles fought with compromised equipment, emergency repairs made under fire, and years of treating critical life support systems like disposable tools. This connection point here, David said, highlighting a section of the spinal interface that showed extensive wear patterns, it's been operating at 60% efficiency for at least 2 years. Curavel's ears twitched. I was not aware of any significant performance degradation. That's because the armor compensated by overclocking the adjacent systems, David explained, showing her the diagnostic readings. It essentially redistributed the load, but that put extra stress on components that were never designed to handle it. Ingenious adaptation. Incredibly sophisticated, David agreed. But also incredibly hard on you. These overclocked systems would have caused constant low-level fatigue, muscle tension, probably headaches. I experienced those symptoms regularly. David paused in his work, looking at the readout that showed just how extensively her armor had been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years. Curavel, these weren't symptoms you had to just endure. They were signs that your equipment needed proper maintenance. Proper maintenance was not available. I understand that. But the fact that it wasn't available doesn't mean you didn't deserve it. The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Curavel went very still, and David could see tension building in her posture that had nothing to do with the armor repairs. Valerian warriors do not concern themselves with comfort, she said, her voice taking on the formal tone David was beginning to recognize as her way of retreating behind cultural conditioning. This isn't about comfort, David replied gently, continuing the delicate work of realigning neural pathways. This is about function. About treating critical equipment, and the person depending on that equipment, with appropriate care. He accessed the memory logs embedded in the armor systems, looking for patterns that would help him optimize the repairs. What he found made him stop working entirely. Curavel, he said carefully, according to these logs, you've been injured in combat 47 times over the past 15 years. Combat carries inherent risks. 47 times, David repeated. And in every case, the armor's medical systems provided only emergency stabilization. No extended recovery protocols, no optimization of healing processes, no adjustment periods for psychological trauma. Extended recovery is a luxury warriors cannot afford. David studied the data more carefully, noting patterns that painted a picture of someone who had been fighting continuously for over a decade with minimal support systems. The armor was designed to support extended healing processes, he said. Look at these specifications. There are entire subroutines for managing recovery from major injuries, optimizing nutrition absorption, even regulating sleep cycles for improved psychological resilience. Those systems were disabled as unnecessary. By who? By me. David looked up from the diagnostic display to find Curavel watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Why would you disable systems designed to keep you healthy? Because dependence on comfort makes warriors weak. The words came out with the precision of something that had been drilled into her so thoroughly it had become automatic. David recognized the tone. He'd heard similar mantras from military personnel who'd been trained to suppress their own needs in service of mission objectives. Curavel, he said quietly, what if I told you that proper maintenance and care would make you a better warrior, not a weaker one? Her ears went completely still, which David had learned was her equivalent of intense focus. Explain. David pulled up a comparison analysis, showing the armor's current performance against its original specifications. Right now, your reaction time is delayed by an average of 0.3 seconds because of neural interface degradation. Your strength enhancement is operating at 73% capacity due to power distribution issues. Your situational awareness is compromised because half the sensor array is operating outside normal parameters. Kiravel studied the data, and David could see her processing the implications. These degradations, they could be corrected. With proper maintenance, yes. But more than that, if we restore the recovery and optimization systems you disabled, your overall performance would actually exceed your baseline from 15 years ago. How? David smiled, warming to the technical explanation. Because the armor learns. Every battle, every injury, every adaptation, it's all stored in the biomechanical memory systems. With proper integration, that experience becomes enhanced capability rather than accumulated damage. He began accessing the disabled subroutines, showing Kiravel the sophisticated recovery protocols that had been lying dormant in her armor for years. These systems aren't about comfort, he explained. They're about optimization. About ensuring that the warrior and the armor function as a perfect integrated unit rather than fighting each other. As David worked to reactivate the recovery systems, he noticed something unexpected in the biomechanical responses. The armor wasn't just accepting the changes, it was responding with what could only be described as relief. Stress indicators that had been elevated for months were dropping to normal levels for the first time since he begun the diagnostic. The armor wants these systems active, he said, more to himself than to Kiravel. What do you mean? Look at these readings. The biomechanical systems are responding to the restoration like someone who's been holding their breath for years and can finally exhale. Kiravel was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than David had heard it before. I have not considered what the armor might prefer. It's bonded to you, David said, continuing the careful work of reintegrating systems that should never have been disabled. It's been trying to keep you alive and functional while operating with massive handicaps. That's got to create stress in the biomechanical matrix. As he spoke, David realized he was working near the armor's primary heart interface, a connection point that required him to place his hands very near Kiravel's chest, close enough to feel her breathing, close enough to sense the elevated heart rate that suggested this conversation was affecting her more than she was letting on. I need to access the cardiac monitoring systems, he said. Is that acceptable? Proceed. David's touch was even more careful here, aware that he was working near the interfaces that regulated some of her most vital systems. As his fingers found the connection points, he felt Kiravel tense. Are you experiencing discomfort? He asked immediately. No, she said, but her voice was strained. The sensation is unfamiliar. David paused. Unfamiliar how? A long silence. Then, very quietly. You are touching me too softly. The words came out like an accusation, but David heard something else underneath, confusion, maybe even distress. He kept his hands perfectly still while he processed what she'd said. Too softly, he repeated. Yes. I am accustomed to efficient handling. Medical necessity. Combat situations. Kiravel's voice was becoming more strained. This is different. David understood then. In 15 years of wearing biomechanical armor, every time someone had touched these interfaces, it had been in situations of extreme stress, battlefield repairs, emergency medical treatment, or routine maintenance focused on function over comfort. No one had ever handled her equipment, and by extension, her, with anything resembling gentleness. Kiravel, he said carefully, has anyone ever worked on your armor who cared whether the process was comfortable for you? The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her breathing became irregular, and David could see stress indicators spiking in the armor's biomechanical systems. That is not relevant, she said, but her voice was shaking slightly. It's completely relevant, David replied gently. You're not just a weapon system to be maintained. You're a person who deserves to be treated with care. He resumed the delicate work, his touch remaining light and careful despite, or perhaps because of, her discomfort with the gentleness. The armor responds better to careful handling anyway, he added. Precision work requires patience. As David continued the repair, he felt Curavel gradually relax, her breathing becoming more regular as the unfamiliar sensation of being treated with care slowly became less threatening. The armor's stress indicators dropped to the lowest levels he'd seen since beginning the diagnostic. "There," he said as the final system came online. "How does that feel?" Curavel was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice held a note of wonder. "It feels like the armor is alive," she said. "Like it is truly part of me, rather than something I wear." "That's how it was designed to feel," David said with satisfaction. "That's how it should have felt all along." But as he began packing up his tools, David noticed that Curavel remained very still, her posture suggesting someone who was processing emotions she had no framework for understanding. "Curavel? Are you all right?" She turned to look at him then, and David was startled by the vulnerability in her expression, the first crack in the stoic warrior facade he'd seen since she'd arrived. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I feel different. The armor feels different. I feel different." "Different how?" A pause. "Cared for," she said quietly. "I feel cared for. And I do not know what to do with that feeling." The next morning, David arrived at his workshop to find Curavel already there, moving through what appeared to be a complex series of combat exercises. But these weren't the rigid, controlled movements he'd observed the day before. Her armor flowed with her like liquid mercury, responding to her intentions with an efficiency and grace that transformed the deadly dance into something almost artistic. "How's the armor feeling?" David asked, settling at his workbench with a cup of coffee that was only marginally better than recycled coolant. "Remarkable," Curavel replied, completing a sequence that involved what looked like fighting 6 imaginary opponents simultaneously. "The response time improvements are beyond my calculations. Every system is operating at specifications I had not experienced since the initial bonding process." David smiled, watching the seamless integration between warrior and armor that proper maintenance had restored. "That's what happens when equipment is allowed to function as designed instead of limping along in damage control mode." Curavel paused in her exercises, turning to face him. In the morning light filtering through the workshop's windows, David could see details he'd missed the day before, the intricate patterns etched into her armor's surface, the subtle way the biomechanical systems pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, the almost imperceptible luminescence that indicated optimal function. "I owe you a debt," she said formally. "You don't owe me anything. This is what I do, fix things that are broken." "I was not broken." David set down his coffee and looked at her carefully. "No, you weren't. But your equipment was, and you were carrying that burden without realizing how much it was costing you." Curavel's ears twitched in what David had learned to recognize as the precursor to a question she wasn't sure she wanted to ask. "Yesterday, when you said I deserved to be treated with care, did you mean that?" "Of course I meant it." "Why?" The simple question carried so much weight that David found himself struggling to answer. How do you explain to someone that they have inherent worth when they've apparently never been taught that concept? "Because you're a person," he said finally. "Because you've spent 15 years fighting battles that kept other people safe, and you did it with equipment that was slowly failing around you, and you never complained or asked for help. Because you deserved better than emergency repairs and field maintenance. Because everyone deserves to be treated with care." Curavel was quiet for a long time, her elongated ears tracking sounds David couldn't even hear. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "In Valerian culture, care is considered a form of weakness. Dependence. A failure of self-sufficiency. What do you think?" Another pause. I think I have been very tired for a very long time, and I did not realize it until the tiredness went away." David nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He'd seen the same phenomenon in equipment that had been operating beyond specifications for extended periods, systems that had adapted to dysfunction so gradually that the degradation became normal. The armor's biomechanical systems show that you've been operating in a state of chronic stress for years, he said gently. Not just from combat, but from the constant low-level strain of using equipment that wasn't functioning properly. And now? Now the stress indicators are lower than I've seen in any Valerian armor on record. The systems are actually optimizing for recovery and long-term health instead of just emergency function. As David spoke, his communication console chimed with an incoming priority message. The signal was military-grade, heavily encrypted, and broadcasting on frequencies that weren't supposed to be available to civilian stations. Kiravel's armor responded to the signal before she did, defensive systems activating automatically as weapons targeting arrays came online. The transformation was instant and startling. One moment she'd been a person having a conversation, the next she was a walking weapons platform scanning for threats. Kiravel of the Stormwind Company, came a voice through the communication array. You are overdue for mission reporting. Explain your status and current location. David watched as every line of Kiravel's body went rigid. The easy grace she'd displayed moments before vanished, replaced by the formal posture of a soldier receiving orders. This is Kiravel, she replied, her voice taking on the same controlled tone. I experienced equipment failure during the ion storm. Repairs are nearly complete. Acknowledged. New contract available. Priority 1 engagement. Transmitting coordinates now. The workshop's display screen lit up with star charts showing a system David didn't recognize, along with tactical assessments and target specifications that made his engineering background very uncomfortable. Whatever the Stormwind Company did, it involved the kind of precision violence that required detailed planning and sophisticated equipment. Time frame for mission readiness, the voice continued. Kiravel looked at David, then at her perfectly functioning armor, then at the tactical display showing a mission that would take her back to the life she'd known for 15 years. 12 hours, she said. Acknowledged. Pickup coordinates transmitted. Do not be late. The communication ended, leaving the workshop in silence except for the subtle humming of David's equipment and the barely audible whisper of Kiravel's armor systems cycling through defensive protocols. So, David said carefully, back to work. Kiravel didn't answer immediately. She stood facing the star charts, her armor's targeting system still active, still scanning for threats that weren't there. This is what I do, she said finally. What I am. Is it what you want to do? The question seemed to surprise her. Want is irrelevant. I am a warrior. I have contracts. Obligations. David looked at the tactical display, noting the kind of equipment specifications and casualty estimates that suggested this wasn't going to be a peaceful negotiation mission. What happens if you don't go? The contract would be forfeit. My reputation would be damaged. Future employment would be difficult. And if you do go? Kiravel's ears flattened slightly. I return to combat with optimally functioning equipment. I complete the mission. I survive or I do not. That's it. That's your long-term plan. It has been sufficient for 15 years. David studied her posture, noting the tension that had returned with the mission briefing, the way her armor had automatically shifted into combat configuration. Yesterday's gentle person who had been amazed by careful treatment was being subsumed by 15 years of warrior conditioning. Kiravel, he said quietly, what if there was another option? What option? David gestured around his workshop, the precision tools, the diagnostic equipment, the peaceful environment where complex problems got solved through patience and skill rather than violence. You could stay. Learn about equipment maintenance, help me with the more sophisticated repair jobs. The station always needs people with advanced technical knowledge. Kiravel turned to stare at him, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling back into rigid control. I am a warrior, she repeated. You're also someone who understands biomechanical systems better than anyone I've ever met, David replied. Someone who's kept incredibly sophisticated equipment functional under impossible conditions. Someone who deserves the chance to find out what life feels like when you're not constantly preparing for the next battle. I would not know how to live such a life. Nobody knows how to live any life until they try it, David said with a smile. Besides, you've got time to figure it out. The next supply ship isn't due for 3 weeks. Kiravel looked back at the tactical display, then at David's workshop, then at her armor's diagnostic readings showing systems that were functioning better than they had in years. The mission parameters suggest high casualty probability, she said quietly. Then maybe it's time to consider whether optimally functioning equipment is worth using if the mission is designed to destroy it. A long silence filled the workshop. David could almost see Kiravel processing the concept of choice, the radical idea that she might have options beyond simply accepting whatever mission came next. Finally, she moved to the communication console and began composing a message. "What are you doing?" David asked. "Informing the Stormwind Company that my equipment suffered critical failures during the ion storm," Kiravel replied, her voice steady but her ears twitching with what David suspected was nervous energy. "Recovery time, indefinite." David grinned. "That's not entirely untrue. The armor did suffer critical failures. And recovery time is indefinite," Kiravel agreed, a hint of something that might have been humor in her voice. "I have never attempted to recover from anything other than physical injury. I do not know how long it might take." "Well then," David said, pulling up the work schedules for the next few weeks, "I guess we'll figure it out together. Fair warning though. The coffee here is terrible, the pay is mediocre, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is someone bringing in a mining suit that's been used as a chew toy by rockworms." Kiravel considered this carefully. "And the work?" "Challenging, precise, and occasionally frustrating. Also, every successful repair means someone gets to go home safe to their family instead of dying in a broken environmental suit." "That sounds," Kiravel paused, as if testing unfamiliar words, "worthwhile." As she sent the message declining the mission, David noticed her armor's biomechanical system's shifting configuration. The combat protocols deactivated, replaced by the optimization settings he'd restored the day before. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The armor was adapting to the possibility of peace instead of constantly preparing for war. "So," David said, offering her a cup of terrible coffee, "ready to learn what it feels like when someone maintains your equipment because you deserve proper care rather than because you need to be combat ready?" Kiravel accepted the coffee, her elongated ears twitching with what David was learning to recognize as anticipation rather than wariness. "I believe," she said, "I would like to find out."